Snow fell over Manhattan like thin silver threads that refused to settle. From the penthouse windows, the city glittered beneath the Hale family's Christmas Eve gala, strings of lights, glasses clinking, conversations in low, elegant tones. Aubrey Collins stood near the 12-foot tree, smoothing the collar of her son's tiny navy sweater, trying to ignore the weight of eyes judging her from across the room. Noel clung to her hand, his small fingers cold and trembling. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Show up, smile, pretend her marriage wasn't collapsing from the inside out. But the moment the elevator chimed, something in the room shifted. People turned. Conversations clipped short. Julian Hale walked in wearing a tailored black tuxedo, confidence dripping from every polished step. And beside him, glittering in a red silk dress, was the young intern everyone had whispered about for months. Julian didn't even hide her tonight. He wanted the world to see. The air froze. Aubrey felt Noel stiffen. His breath hitched as he stared at the man he once ran to with unfiltered joy. The father he'd waited for every night. The father who promised he was busy, not gone. Julian smiled like nothing was wrong, like his family wasn't standing there unraveling because of him. He opened his arms as if expecting Noel to run to him. Instead, Noel's little face hardened with a pain too old for 5 years. He turned away. He buried himself against Aubrey's coat, shoulders shaking, refusing even to look at his father. A gasp rippled across the room. Champagne flutes paused mid-air. At the far end of the staircase, Richard Hale, Julian's father, the man who rarely spoke more than a polite nod to Aubrey, stood frozen, eyes sweeping between the child, the intern, and his son's smug expression. Something ancient and heavy moved behind his stare. Julian's smile faltered. "Noel," he said sharply, "come here. Now. Hamstove. Has wise." But Noel clung tighter to his mother, whispering, "I don't want him, Mommy." The room held its breath. And that was the moment Richard Hale stepped forward, his voice steady enough to cut the music entirely, and changed the entire course of the night. Before she ever became a Hale, before Manhattan penthouses and holiday galas, Aubrey Collins belonged to a quieter world, one of second-hand coats, bus rides that rattled through Queens, and a small public library that smelled faintly of old paper and children's crayons. She never cared about glitter or power. She cared about keeping the lights on, keeping her anxiety under control, and keeping her little brother out of trouble long enough to survive adulthood. That was her life. Ordinary, barely holding together, but honest. Aubrey had grown up learning not to expect rescue from anyone. Her mother died when she was 9. Her father disappeared 2 years later, leaving only debts and an eviction notice taped to their door. She learned to outrun fear by working, babysitting, stacking books, later taking the job at the Queen's Public Library as a circulation assistant. She loved the children who came to her desk with sticky hands and curious eyes, kids who wanted stories, the same way she once did. Even when money was thin, Aubrey carried herself with a gentleness that made people pause. But gentleness doesn't protect you from the world, especially not from someone like Julian Hale. The night she met him, she was shelving returned books while sipping a lukewarm Starbucks latte she couldn't really afford. A man in a charcoal coat and expensive shoes approached the counter, asking for a printer code. He didn't look like he belonged there. Everything about him screamed Park Avenue. Aubrey assumed he was lost, but Julian wasn't lost. He was hunting. He struck up a conversation so effortlessly it felt scripted. He told her she had a librarian's smile, whatever that meant. He asked her about her favorite books, pretended to care, and laughed at all the right moments. She didn't know yet that Julian mirrored whoever he wanted to control. She only knew she hadn't felt seen like that in years. So when he showed up the next week, then the next Aubrey let herself believe in luck. In romance, in a life that could be softer than the one she'd always known. But luck came with shadows. Julian learned quickly about her heart surgery at 26. The debt she was still paying off. the brother she tried to save from addiction. He played the role of rescuer so convincingly that she didn't notice how easily she was being shaped into someone dependent, someone grateful. It felt like love. But only later would she recognize how control can disguise itself as care. When Julian proposed, Richard Hale didn't attend the engagement dinner. Aubrey thought it was because he disliked small gatherings. In reality, he didn't believe a woman from Queens should carry the Hale name. It was the first time she felt the sting of judgment from a family she desperately wanted to belong to. But Julian held her hand, promising he'd protect her from everything, including his father. Promises were cheap for him, but Aubrey didn't know that yet. After their wedding, she moved into the sleek penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, where Manhattan glowed like a distant promise. She tried to fit in, tried to make the Hale world her own. She learned which fork to use, how to greet investors politely, how to avoid drawing attention to the fact she'd grown up sharing a bedroom with her brother. And when Noah was born, she let herself believe she had finally built something real, something safe. But the Hale family had a way of testing softness until it cracked. During Noah's early years, Julian's love shifted into impatience, then irritation, then something colder. Aubrey blamed herself. She worked harder, loved harder, stretched herself thin trying to keep her little boy's world bright, so he would never feel the abandonment she once felt. Yet even then, she sensed something breaking beneath the surface, something sharp and dangerous wearing Julian's smile. And though she didn't know it yet, the world she'd built was about to collapse in ways she could never prepare for. And Noah would be the first to sense the storm coming. The Hale penthouse wasn't just a home. It was a castle suspended above Manhattan, a place where glass walls reflected the skyline and wealth hummed in the quiet air, like a constant reminder of who held the power. When Aubrey first stepped into the space as Julian's new wife, she felt small but hopeful, imagining she could become part of this world as long as she loved hard enough and worked quietly enough. She didn't know then that this world wasn't built for women like her. It was built to swallow them whole. Every morning, the city glittered beneath the massive windows, the sun catching the silver curve of the East River. Julian would drink his espresso while scrolling through stock tickers on his MacBook Pro, barely looking up as Aubrey prepared Noah's breakfast. The penthouse was beautiful, yes, but it was cold, cold in a way that lived in the walls, cold in the way silence settled after Julian left for work without kissing his son goodbye. Manhattan was supposed to be a fresh start for her, yet the higher she lived, the smaller she felt. Julian's world stretched far beyond the penthouse. The Park Avenue office tower where he strutted through glass corridors, the private dining rooms where investors toasted to numbers Aubrey didn't understand, the rooftop lounges where he brought clients, and, as she later learned, someone else entirely. Meanwhile, Aubrey's world shrank to places no one in the Hale circle noticed. The elevator she rode alone with Noah, the kitchen counter where she reheated leftover pasta, the shadowed hallway where she sometimes cried quietly, so her son wouldn't hear. Yet despite the loneliness, Aubrey created small corners of warmth. She set up a reading nook for Noah with soft blankets and his favorite storybooks. She kept a tiny Christmas ornament from her childhood on a shelf, something her mother had saved from a yard sale decades ago. It didn't match the luxury decor, and more than once, a Hale guest had lifted an eyebrow at it, but she kept it anyway, refusing to let the world erase her. Julian noticed these touches, and each time, his disapproval grew sharper. He would say things like, "This isn't Queens, Aubrey," or "Try not to make the place look sentimental," as if sentiment was a flaw. He replaced the ornament with a designer crystal globe one year, placing it front and center like a trophy. She didn't argue. She simply moved her ornament to Noah's shelf, where Julian wouldn't notice. Manhattan wasn't just a backdrop for their marriage. It became a battlefield, subtle, elegant, and relentless. At family events, investors' wives examined Aubrey like she was a museum piece missing a plaque. She learned to smile tightly, answer questions politely, and pretend she didn't hear whispers about her background. At Hale gatherings, Conversations danced around hedge funds, European villas, and ski trips in Aspen. Aubrey contributed stories about library programs, children's books, and affordable cooking tricks, none of which impressed anyone. But the hardest place of all was Richard Hale's townhouse on the Upper East Side. Every stair, every chandelier, every antique felt like a silent judgment. Richard barely spoke during dinners. When he did, his questions cut deeper than insults. "And how is the library work?" Or, "Is Noah speaking clearly yet?" As though she were somehow delaying her son's development. Still, Aubrey tried. She dressed neatly. She practiced her posture. She taught Noah to say, "Thank you," and "Good evening," just the way the Hales liked. But no matter how hard she tried, something in this world remained unwelcoming, like a door that shut just as she reached it. What she didn't know was that this world was already cracking beneath Julian's feet, and she was about to be blamed for the fractures she didn't cause. By the time Christmas approached, the penthouse felt less like a home and more like a stage, one where the lights were too bright, the audience was unforgiving, and the script was rigged against her. And behind those glass walls, something dark was preparing to break loose, and Aubrey was standing in its path. Julian Hale wasn't always the storm that tore Aubrey's life apart. When she first met him, he felt like a shelter-warm voice, confident stride, a man who seemed to know exactly where he was going. But the truth was simpler and much darker. Julian never moved toward anything. He moved away from expectations, from accountability, from a father who measured success in empires and looked at his son like a half-finished project. In the Hale world, Julian was the prince who never earned his crown. He grew up in private academies, drifting through elite circles with a charisma that fooled everyone except those who mattered. Richard Hale, his father, saw it clearly. Charm without depth, ambition without backbone. Yet, instead of guiding him, Richard withdrew, choosing business over fatherhood. Julian learned early that love, if it existed, was conditional, so he made himself untouchable. By the time he met Aubrey, he had perfected the art of wearing masks. To outsiders, Julian was a rising financial star, polished, articulate, magnetic. But inside the penthouse walls, that polish chipped away. He grew restless when things weren't effortless. He hated vulnerability, especially Aubrey's quiet resilience, which reminded him of everything he lacked. When Noah was born, Julian tried for a month, maybe 2. Then the nights became too loud, the responsibility too heavy, the mess too real. He slipped back into old habits, late nights, long business trips, lies disguised as exhaustion. But the most dangerous part wasn't the cheating or the disappearing. It was the simmering resentment he developed toward the 2 people who loved him most. Julian couldn't stand that Aubrey had made a home without needing his approval. He hated that Noah clung to her, not him. In his twisted view, love became a competition he kept losing. As financial pressure mounted from his reckless trading, Julian began searching for someone easier to impress a woman who didn't see through him. That's when he found the intern, a young woman dazzled by his charm and intimidated by his title. With her, he could rewrite his failures. With her, he felt powerful again. But power was never enough. Behind the scenes, Julian started preparing a future where Aubrey no longer existed. He met with lawyers to discuss a postnup. He suggested, then insisted, that Aubrey see a psychiatrist, planting notes about her unstable mood in case he needed documentation. He even told a few trusted colleagues that she struggled with postpartum episodes. Despite Noah being nearly 5, every move was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Still, the biggest shift came the night he returned from a supposed work trip, smelling of perfume and whiskey. Aubrey confronted him gently, just a question, not even an accusation, and Julian realized something crucial. Aubrey wasn't afraid of the truth, and that terrified him. Fear was the only currency he understood, so he escalated, slamming doors, twisting words, planting doubts, whispering to Noah. Mummy gets confused sometimes, as if conditioning his own child to see her as fragile. Then came the lie that crossed a line even he once thought sacred. He staged a medical crisis, fake scans, a fake diagnosis, a fake timeline. Claiming early-stage lymphoma, he told Aubrey he needed her to sign temporary power of attorney papers just until treatment stabilized. She signed without hesitation. She loved him enough to trust, and he loved her too little to care. From that moment, Julian stopped pretending. He didn't want a wife. He wanted immunity. By Christmas, he had crafted the perfect story. A struggling wife, a failing marriage, a son better off with him, and a lover waiting in the wings. All he needed was the right stage, and the Hail Christmas Eve gala was the stage he chose. What he didn't know was that while he prepared his grand betrayal, someone else in the family had begun to watch him closely. The Hail Christmas Eve gala was supposed to be elegant, controlled, the kind of night that appeared in society columns with words like flawless and distinguished. Richard Hale hosted it every year, inviting business partners, political allies, and old friends who appreciated his reputation for excellence. But this year, a different energy pulsed through the penthouse, uneasy, electric, as if everyone sensed a story unfolding beneath the surface. Aubrey felt it too. She tried to ignore it while adjusting Noel's collar, smoothing his hair, whispering that everything was fine even though she could barely steady her own hands. Julian had left the penthouse early that morning with no explanation, telling her only to look presentable for the event. The words stung. They always did. By the time guests arrived, the rooms glowed with polished silver trays, the scent of evergreen garlands, and soft jazz floating from a grand piano. Aubrey moved through the crowd like a ghost, polite smiles, quiet greetings, her heart beating too loud beneath her dress. She avoided mirrors. She didn't want to see the nervousness etched on her face. Yet people noticed anyway. Is she all right? She looks thinner. Julian said she's been overwhelmed. She heard fragments of whispered concerns disguised as sympathy. They were seeds Julian had been planting for months, and tonight they sprouted effortlessly. When the elevator chimed, everything stopped. Julian stepped out, hand in hand with the young intern, a woman whose confidence sparkled brighter than her sequined red dress. Their arrival wasn't an accident. It was a performance. Julian didn't look at Aubrey. He didn't look at his son. He surveyed the room like a man unveiling a masterpiece. People gasped. A few covered their mouths. Others watched with a hunger for scandal that made Aubrey nauseous. She gathered Noel closer, feeling his little fingers curl into her dress. "Mommy, why is Daddy with her?" Aubrey couldn't answer. Julian approached the center of the room where Richard stood with several executives. He raised his glass as if proposing a toast. "I have an announcement," he said, loud enough for the music to dim. Aubrey's chest tightened. Richard's brow lifted a warning, but Julian ignored it. "For months," Julian continued, "our family has navigated challenges, emotional strain, instability." He turned deliberately toward Aubrey, his voice dripping with rehearsed concern. "My wife hasn't been well." Whispers erupted. Aubrey felt the world tilt. Instability. Not well. This was his setup, his narrative, his trap. She shook her head silently, eyes burning, but Julian smiled sympathetically at the crowd like a martyr. "I didn't want to discuss this publicly," he lied, "but for Noel's future and my responsibilities to the company, I can't hide the truth any longer." Aubrey's breath shattered. He was doing it. He was painting her as unfit, right here, in front of the people who could influence custody, reputation, everything. The intern placed a soft hand on Julian's arm, playing her part. Julian exhaled dramatically. "Tonight, I'm asking for your understanding as I take necessary steps to protect my son." The room blurred. Aubrey felt herself fading. Then, Noah's voice pierced the silence. "Stop lying, Daddy." Every head turned. Julian froze mid-sentence. Noel stepped forward, small but shaking with truth. "Mummy's not sick. You are. You pushed her at the hotel. You scared her." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Julian's mask cracked, and before he could speak, before he could salvage the moment, a deeper voice cut the air cleanly in half. "Julian," Richard said, stepping forward, "that's enough." The music died completely. The entire night had shifted, and Julian's plan was beginning to unravel. The moment Richard's voice sliced through the room, the gala fractured like glass. Conversations halted, the intern's smile disintegrated, and Julian's expression tensed into something sharp and dangerous. But for Aubrey, the world had already gone underwater. She felt as if she were drowning in slow motion, watching her life crumble while her own heartbeat thundered in her ears. Noel tugged at her hand, his small voice trembling. "Mummy, are you okay?" She couldn't answer. Her chest tightened so violently she had to step back, gripping a nearby column just to stay upright. The stunning chandelier above blurred into a smear of gold. She heard people whisper, some concerned, others gleeful at the unfolding drama. Is she having an episode? Did Julian say she was unstable? Poor thing. Or maybe he's right. The words stabbed her one by one. Julian seized the moment. He moved toward her with rehearsed urgency, lifting his hands as though guiding a fragile patient. "See, this is what I've been dealing with," he announced to the crowd. "Aubrey, sit down. You're not well." No, it was the final insult spoken sweetly, publicly, intentionally. Aubrey flinched. "Don't," she whispered, voice cracking, but Julian grabbed her arm anyway, giving it a controlling squeeze masked as concern. His breath brushed her ear. "Make a scene and I'll take Noah tomorrow morning. Permanently." Terror shot through her. Her knees weakened. She pulled away sharply, but the sudden movement made her stumble. Gasps erupted. Someone reached to steady her, but she shook them off. She wasn't collapsing because she was unstable. She was collapsing because the man she once trusted was now dismantling her life piece by piece while pretending to save her. Noel burst into tears. "Stop touching Mummy," he cried, voice echoing across the marble floor. Aubrey crouched down to hold him, her body trembling. She wished she could be strong for him, but the weight was too heavy. Weeks of fear, months of manipulation, years of trying to fit into a world that rejected her, all of it crushed her at once. She buried her face in Noah's hair and let out a sound she didn't recognize, a small, broken sob. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the sound of someone finally understanding she had no safety left. Richard watched from across the room, his jaw tightening. For the first time, something like regret flickered in his eyes. He saw not a fragile woman, but someone who had been pushed to the brink. The intern, suddenly unsure, took a step back from Julian. Even she sensed the cruelty in the air. Julian tried again, louder this time. "Aubrey, you need help. This isn't normal." The humiliation burned. She could feel dozens of eyes pinning her to the floor. Aubrey gathered Noah into her arms, whispering, "Mummy's okay. Mummy's here." Though she barely believed it herself. She stood, wobbling but determined. She turned to leave the room, to escape the suffocating judgment. But Julian blocked her path. "You're not walking out of here like this," he said quietly. "People need to understand what you're battling." Her voice broke. "Please, move." He didn't. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest as the panic rose tight, suffocating, familiar. She had fought anxiety since childhood, but never like this. Never while the man she married shoved her deeper into it. Her vision dimmed at the edges. She swayed. Noah screamed her name, and just as her body began to give out, strong hands caught her, not Julian's, but Richard's. "Enough," Richard growled. His voice didn't just quiet the room, it froze it. Aubrey felt herself collapsing into the arms of the last person she ever expected to save her. Richard steadied her, turning cold eyes toward his son. "You've done more damage tonight than you can possibly understand, Ma." And in that moment, Aubrey realized something she never imagined. She wasn't the only one who had finally seen Julian clearly. Something was shifting, something big. Richard Hale was not a man easily shaken, but as he helped Aubrey steady herself, feeling how light she'd become, how violently she trembled, something inside him shifted, something long buried under decades of pride and silence. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not weakness but a woman crushed beneath a sun he no longer recognized. Julian sensed that shift and panicked. "Dad, don't get pulled into her drama," he said, trying to regain control. "You know how she gets when..." "When what, Julian?" Richard's voice echoed through the stunned room. "Finish the sentence." Julian swallowed, the mask slipping. "She's unwell. I've documented everything. I've spoken to doctors. I've tried to get her help, but she refuses." Aubrey's breath caught. This was the narrative he had been building, and hearing it spoken so calmly, so confidently, made the entire room lean toward believing him, until another voice broke in. "Is that why you kept visiting Dr. Feldman alone?" Charlotte Hale, Julian's younger sister, stepped forward, arms crossed, eyes blazing. "Funny how every appointment you made was scheduled when Aubrey was home with Noah." Julian stiffened. "Charlotte, stay out of this." But she didn't. She had been quietly watching her brother unravel for months. "And funny," she continued, "how you asked his office for a letter stating she had episodes without ever bringing her to a single session." Gasps. Aubrey's knees weakened again. But Charlotte wasn't finished. She held up her phone, unlocking it with a swipe. "Dad, you need to see this. All of you do." Richard took the phone, his face unreadable as he pressed play. Audio filled the room, Julian's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Just sign it, Aubrey. The doctors said early-stage lymphoma. I don't have time to argue." Aubrey's voice, frightened. "Julian, what are you talking about? What doctor? You said you were fine. You never listen. I'm trying to protect our family. Just sign the power of attorney. It's temporary." The recording continued, every lie, every manipulation, every calculated push. Richard's hand tightened around the phone. The room was dead silent. Julian lunged forward. "That recording is taken out of context." She knew nothing," Richard snapped. "But I knew something was wrong. I hired a private investigator months ago. And do you know what he found?" Julian froze. Richard looked at his son with a bitterness that came from years of disappointment. Not a sick wife, not a fragile mother, but a dishonest man hiding a financial disaster. Whispers erupted. Executives stared. The intern stepped back in fear. Aubrey's heart pounded. She didn't know Richard had investigated anything. She didn't know he'd been quietly gathering truths while she silently fell apart. Richard handed Charlotte's phone to Mr. Whitford, the family attorney, who had been lingering near the back. "Whitford, tell them." The attorney cleared his throat. Julian liquidated restricted assets without authorization. He forged signatures, and he attempted to transfer funds to an offshore account last month. Aubrey gasped. Charlotte's jaw clenched. The guests held their breath, but the final blow was yet to come. Richard walked toward Aubrey, stopping just inches from her, his voice quieter but trembling with conviction. "I also reviewed your late wife's trust," Charlotte whispered to him, prompting him to continue. Richard nodded. "Yes, what Julian never told you, Aubrey, is that my wife, his mother, left a personal provision, a separate trust, hidden in the estate file. It doesn't go to Julian." Julian stumbled backward. "Dad, no. It goes to you," Richard finished. "To the woman she hoped her son would one day deserve." Aubrey covered her mouth, stunned. "She saw the goodness in you before any of us did," Richard said. "And tonight, I finally understand why." Julian's face drained of color. His plan had collapsed publicly, brutally, irreversibly. And in the center of the room, the truth finally stood with Aubrey. And for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. The morning after the gala felt unreal, as though Aubrey had slipped into a life belonging to someone braver, stronger, more deserving than she ever believed herself to be. The sunrise spilled across the penthouse windows, casting soft gold over the same rooms that had once suffocated her. But the air felt different now, lighter, sharper, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Julian was gone. Richard's security team had escorted him out some time after midnight, leaving a silence more peaceful than any apology he could ever give. The intern had vanished too, along with whatever illusions she'd clung to the night before. Aubrey sat at the dining table, a cup of untouched tea cooling between her hands. Noah slept in the next room, exhausted from the emotional storm he'd weathered. She wished she could shield him from everything, but children sense truth before adults do. He had known something was wrong long before she admitted it. Charlotte entered quietly, holding a neatly folded stack of clothes. "Thought you might want something that's not yesterday's disaster," she said gently. Aubrey managed a small laugh, surprised she even could. "Thank you. I didn't know you were watching." Charlotte sat across from her. "I've been watching for a long time. I just didn't know how to help until it mattered." Aubrey looked down at her hands, steady for the first time in months. "I feel like I'm waking up in someone else's life." "No," Charlotte corrected softly. "You're waking up in yours, too." Hours later, after a long shower that felt like washing away years of fear, Aubrey dressed in the clothes Charlotte brought. Simple black trousers, a soft cream blouse, nothing extravagant. But when she caught her reflection, she didn't see the frightened woman from the gala. She saw fire, determination, a face shaped not by luxury but by surviving it. Richard was waiting for her in his study, a room lined with dark mahogany shelves and city maps framed in gold. He rose when she entered, something almost fatherly in his expression. "Aubrey," he began, "I owe you apologies I can't articulate well. I misjudged you. Worse, I allowed myself to ignore what was right in front of me." She shook her head. "You didn't know." "I should have," he insisted. "My silence enabled Julian. That ends now." He motioned to a folder on his desk. Aubrey hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents, legal ones bearing her name, the trust from Julian's mother, access to a townhouse in Brooklyn, financial protections, custody advisors, a team at her disposal. Her throat tightened. "Richard, this is yours," he interrupted. "Not charity. Not pity. My wife left it for you because she believed her son would need a woman of strength. I now see she wasn't wrong." Emotion stung her eyes. She quickly blinked it back. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted. "Then start small," Richard said. "Start with choosing yourself for once." Windu passed. His words landed deep, pressing into places she'd never dared explore. Later that afternoon, Charlotte took her shopping, but not for glamour, just intentional pieces. A fitted black coat, a pair of boots that made her feel grounded, a simple, elegant shoulder bag. No flash, no hale perfection, just Aubrey reinvented, not transformed into someone she wasn't. Back at the penthouse, she tied her hair loosely, applied a light touch of makeup, and took a long breath. She didn't look wealthy. She didn't look powerful. She looked whole. Noah woke from his nap and blinked at her. "Mummy, you look new." Aubrey smiled, lifting him into her arms. "I think I am." That evening, she stepped out onto the balcony, the Manhattan skyline glowing beneath a lavender sky. For the first time since she'd moved here, the city didn't feel like a cage. It felt like possibility. Behind her, Charlotte whispered, "He won't see you coming." Aubrey's eyes hardened with quiet resolve. "Good," she said, "because I'm done running." She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was rising. The boardroom of Hale Investments was not designed for drama. It was built for decisions, cold, calculated, profitable decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, while a 14-foot table of polished walnut reflected every tension-filled stare. Executives, attorneys, and senior partners filled the seats, murmuring as they waited for the emergency meeting Richard had called. Aubrey entered quietly, wearing the black coat and calm resolve she had earned, not borrowed. She wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to win approval. She was here to end something. Charlotte walked beside her like a shield, and Mr. Whitford followed with a stack of sealed documents. Rumors had already spread about the gala, but no one expected her to walk into the heart of Hale Power. When Julian arrived, the air shifted. He barged into the room, jaw clenched, suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. His confidence was gone. Fury trembled under his skin. "You don't belong in here," he spat at Aubrey. "This is a company meeting." Richard's voice cut through him. "She has more right to be here today than you do." Julian laughed, but it cracked in the middle. "Really? You brought your emotional disaster of a daughter-in-law to humiliate me again? Dad, this is insane. She doesn't even understand our business." Aubrey didn't flinch. "No. But I understand lies." Executives shifted. Someone closed a laptop like they knew a storm was coming. Julian leaned forward. "Aubrey, this isn't your world." She met his glare without blinking. "It wasn't. You made sure of that. But now I'm here because of your choices, not mine." Einthelf. Richard stood at the head of the table, commanding silence. "Julian Hale, before this board, I'm presenting evidence gathered over the last 6 months. Evidence of unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, misappropriated funds, and the deliberate framing of your wife to protect yourself." Julian's face drained. "You set me up." "You set yourself up," Richard answered. "I simply uncovered it." Mr. Whitford opened a folder and slid copies across the table. Executives leaned in, brows furrowing, whispers rising. All the offshore transactions, the falsified accounting, the fake medical paperwork used to coerce Aubrey into signing over authority. But the blow that hit hardest came from Charlotte. She projected a video on the large screen, footage from a resort hallway. Aubrey stumbling, Julian grabbing her arm, a shove, quick, cruel, unmistakable. A gasp rippled across the boardroom. Julian turned toward Charlotte. "Betrayed. You had no right. You had no right to hurt her," Charlotte snapped. "Or to drag our nephew into your lies." Julian stepped back, chest heaving. "You're all ungrateful. Everything I did was to protect this family." Aubrey rose slowly, her voice steady. "You didn't protect anything. You destroyed the one thing that mattered, trust." He whirled on her. "You think you've won. You think anyone will believe you. Look at you. You can't survive without me." It was meant to break her. Instead, it ignited something fierce. "I survived before you," she said softly, "and I will survive long after you. The difference now is, I'm not afraid." The room held its breath. Richard turned to the board. "Effective immediately, Julian Hale is suspended, pending full investigation. Control of his shares will transfer to the trustee named in the secondary estate file." Julian scoffed. "And who is that? Charlotte?" Richard shook his head. "No." He looked at Aubrey. "It's her." Einquote. The room erupted. Julian's voice cracked with disbelief. "You gave her my inheritance, my position, my company?" "No," Richard corrected. "Your mother did. I merely honored her wishes." Aubrey stood frozen, stunned, breath unsteady. She never wanted power. But now it wasn't about power. It was about freedom. Security approached. Julian backed away, voice splintering into a desperate cry. "This isn't over. You can't erase me. I'm your son." "Those." "Rees." Richard faced him with a sorrow older than the company itself. "I know, and that's the tragedy." As Julian was escorted out, he locked eyes with Aubrey, fury burning. But for the first time, his anger didn't touch her. She exhaled, long and steady, as the room watched. She had walked into the boardroom as Julian's shadow. She walked out as her own sunrise. Winter settled over Brooklyn with a softer hand than the sharp winds of Manhattan. Snow lined the narrow streets outside the townhouse. Richard had transferred to Aubrey weeks earlier, a place with creaky floors and warm light, nothing like the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Here, her laughter didn't echo against cold marble. It simply lived. Noah sat on the rug, building a tiny city out of wooden blocks. Occasionally he looked up at her, as if checking she was still there, still steady, still his. Every time she smiled back, he relaxed a little more. Healing wasn't a moment. It was 100 small reassurances. Aubrey folded laundry by the window, soaking in a type of peace she'd forgotten existed. She wasn't naive. She knew the last few months had left scars, but scars meant survival. And survival meant she had made it through something meant to break her. Her phone buzzed. A message from Charlotte. He's officially removed. The board voted this morning. You did it, Aubrey. She hadn't done it alone, she thought. Charlotte, Richard, Mr. Whitford, even the attorney who brought the final documents, they had each played a role. But she had done the hardest part. She hadn't given up on herself. A soft knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Richard Hale standing on the steps, snow dusting his coat shoulders. He looked older under the winter light, but warmer, somehow less steel, more human. I hope I'm not disturbing, he said. You're not, she replied, truly meaning it. Richard stepped inside, glancing at Noah, who beamed and ran into his arms. The sight never failed to soften Aubrey's heart. This version of Richard, the version willing to reach, to make up for lost time, was one she never expected to meet. I brought something, he said, handing her an envelope. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, the elegant script, unmistakably that of Richard's late wife, Lillian Hale. A letter addressed to the woman my son will one day marry. Aubrey's breath caught. She read slowly, letting each line settle. Lillian's hope that Julian would find someone gentle but strong, someone whose love was not rooted in fear or wealth, but kindness, someone who could give what she herself had wished she'd given Richard, more of warmth. Tears blurred the edges of the words. She somehow knew you, Richard said quietly, before any of us did. Aubrey pressed the letter to her chest, not because of the inheritance, or the trust, or the newfound stability, but because someone, somewhere, had believed in her long before she believed in herself. Richard's voice softened. You built a home here, not out of money, out of dignity. And I want you to know, I'm proud of the woman my grandson looks up to. She didn't expect the warmth that bloomed in her chest. Once, she'd wanted Richard's approval only because it would make Julian kinder. Now she realized she valued it because it came from a man who had learned to see her clearly. As they spoke, Noah climbed into her lap, resting his head against her. She kissed his hair and whispered, "We're okay now." He nodded sleepily, trusting her completely. Later that night, after Richard left, Aubrey stepped onto the small balcony overlooking the snowy street. The cold air filled her lungs, crisp and honest. Manhattan glittered in the distance, no longer a cage but a horizon. Her phone buzzed again. This time, Nathan Pierce, the financial consultant who had helped reorganize the trust at Richard's request. A quiet man, widowed, steady in ways Julian never was, checking if you and Noah need anything. No pressure, just here if needed. Aubrey smiled, not because she needed saving, but because the world finally felt full of people who saw her as human, not fragile. She typed back, "We're okay, but thank you, truly." Round, when she put the phone down, she whispered into the winter air, "I'm not afraid anymore." And it was true. Aubrey Collins had walked through betrayal, humiliation, manipulation, and fear, and emerged with her son, her dignity, and the love of a family she never realized she could choose. Her story wasn't about falling, it was about rising. and as snow drifted softly around her, she understood something she wished every woman could know. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply refuses to break. The fallout from the boardroom confrontation didn't settle quietly. It rippled across Manhattan like a winter storm, hitting the skyline, swift, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Within 48 hours, news outlets began whispering about internal shifts at Hale Investments, though the full truth remained shielded behind legal confidentiality. Still, those closest to power already knew the story. Julian Hale had fallen, and it had been a spectacular fall. Aubrey watched the chaos from a distance, no longer pulled into the noise. She spent the first week after the meeting focusing on Noah morning pancakes, afternoon library trips, small routines meant to rebuild his sense of safety. He clung to her more tightly than usual, as though the world had proven itself too unpredictable to trust. One evening, while she folded his laundry and tucked his toys into their new bins, Noah looked up and asked, "Mummy, Daddy's not coming back, right?" Aubrey knelt beside him. "He can still see you," she said carefully, "but he won't live with us again. Not unless it's safe." Noah processed that slowly, then nodded. "Okay, I like it quiet here." Her heart swelled with both sorrow and relief. Meanwhile, Julian spiraled. Security footage soon surfaced of him storming out of his father's estate, screaming at paparazzi, kicking a trash bin when no one answered his calls. The intern filed her own complaint, fearful he would retaliate after using her and discarding her. Investors who once praised him now avoided his name like a contagious rumor. But the most devastating blow wasn't public humiliation. It was private. Richard refused to take his calls. Julian tried everything: emails, voice messages, even showing up unannounced at the townhouse, only to be turned away at the gate. He yelled, threatened, pleaded, but Richard, for the first time in his life, chose boundaries over blood. And that cut Julian deeper than any corporate loss. Meanwhile, Aubrey was healing, not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly. She met with a therapist recommended by Charlotte, learning to name the things she had endured: manipulation, coercion, emotional battery. She learned that healing wasn't about erasing pain, but acknowledging it without letting it define her. One cold January afternoon, Aubrey visited her old library job in Queens. The children's section still smelled like crayons and paperback glue. Her former co-workers hugged her tight, surprised but happy to see her. For a moment, she wondered if she might return someday, not out of necessity but nostalgia, maybe even love. But her life was no longer confined to small corners. She had choices now. The townhouse in Brooklyn slowly became a home. She painted the kitchen walls pale blue with Charlotte's help, bought mismatched mugs that made her smile, and let Noah choose glow-in-the-dark stars for his bedroom ceiling. Every decision, however small, felt like reclaiming a life she'd once thought she didn't deserve. Still, the biggest shift came 2 weeks after the board meeting. Richard invited her to dinner, not formal, not business, just dinner. When she arrived, he was standing by the stove, awkwardly stirring pasta sauce, like a man who had only recently rediscovered the kitchen. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said once they sat down. "I just hope, in time, you might allow me to be a part of your life." And Noah's. Aubrey looked at him, the man who had once intimidated her, who had doubted her, who had unknowingly allowed her suffering. Now he simply looked tired, human, trying. "You already are," she said softly. He swallowed hard, the emotion visible. The conversation drifted into stories, memories of Lillian, reflections on fatherhood, admissions of regrets too old to mend. For the first time, they spoke not as victim and patriarch, not as outcast and gatekeeper, but as two people learning to rebuild something broken. By the end of the evening, Aubrey realized something profound. Family isn't inherited, it's chosen, and sometimes healed. As she walked home through lightly falling snow, Noah's mittened hand in hers, She breathed deeply. The cold air no longer stung. It awakened. Her world was shifting again. Not collapsing this time, but opening. And for the first time in years, the future didn't scare her. It called to her. Life had finally begun to feel steady again. But healing has a strange way of revealing truth. Truth that waits until a person is strong enough to face it. For Aubrey, that moment arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. She was sorting through boxes Richard had sent from the penthouse storage documents, photos, old holiday cards. Most of it was harmless, but near the bottom of a worn folder, she found an envelope with her name typed neatly across the front. Not handwritten, typed. Her heart tightened. She hadn't typed it. Neither had Richard. And Julian. He hadn't written anything for her in years. Inside was a set of medical invoices. She froze. The dates were from 18 months earlier. Surgeries, treatments, specialist consultations, each one billed under her name, but she had never received any treatment during that time. She'd barely visited a doctor. At the bottom, insurance claims, prescriptions, a note marked follow-up for neurological evaluation. Her hands trembled. Julian hadn't just implied she was unstable, he'd forged documents months before building his narrative. He'd created a medical paper trail to frame her as mentally unfit, long before the resort incident, long before the gala. It was all part of a plan that started when she was still forgiving him. Nausea rolled over her. She pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to believe she had already faced the worst of him, but this cruelty was deeper, sharper, almost unbelievable. She sank to the floor, documents scattered around her, like pieces of a life she didn't recognize. A soft knock pulled her back. It was Charlotte. "Richard said you might find that box today," she said quietly. Aubrey held up the papers. "Did you know about this?" Charlotte hesitated. "Not all of it. I knew he was manipulating things, but I didn't know he went this far." Aubrey felt tears burn behind her eyes. Why would he do this? Why was destroying me easier than leaving me? Charlotte knelt beside her. Because leaving you meant facing his own failures. Blaming you was easier. You became his excuse. Aubrey shook her head, whispering, "I trusted him, even when he didn't deserve it." Charlotte placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's not weakness, Aubrey. That's who you are. And it's why he tried to break you, because he couldn't be what you believed he was." Later that afternoon, Richard arrived after Charlotte called him. He studied the documents, his face darkening with every forged signature, every fake prescription. "He intended to make you look incompetent," Richard said quietly. "If things hadn't come to light, he could have taken Noah." The thought nearly crushed her. Richard's jaw tightened. "Aubrey, I need to show you something else." He handed her a locked leather binder. Inside were pages of Julian's financial notes, scribbles, plans, calculations, and at the back, a section titled Exit Strategy. Her name was written there. So was Noah's. Line after line revealed Julian's plan to move assets offshore, divorce her quietly, and seek full custody by using the fabricated medical record. A new life in another city, another country far from her. Aubrey's breath shattered. Was he planning to take my son away permanently? Richard lowered his head. Yes. Silence engulfed the room. After a few minutes, Aubrey whispered, "How do I forgive myself for staying so long?" "You don't," Richard said softly. "You forgive yourself for surviving." She studied him, this man who once doubted her, now standing firmly in her corner. "Why are you helping me so much?" she asked quietly. Richard swallowed. "Because I failed someone before. My wife, and I won't fail you and Noah too." For the first time, Aubrey didn't feel alone inside the wreckage of truth. She gathered the documents, steadying her breath. These weren't weapons anymore. They were evidence. They were closure. They were the final pieces of a puzzle she hadn't seen fully until now. And as she stood up, Her voice no longer shook. "I'm done being afraid of the past," she said. "Let's finish this." Richard nodded, pride flickering behind his eyes. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, Aubrey wasn't trapped inside it. She was walking through it, and emerging stronger than he ever expected. The following week unfolded with an eerie calm, the kind that settles after a storm but before the world decides what comes next. Aubrey moved through each day, deliberately slow mornings with Noah, quiet evenings organizing legal papers, small walks through Brooklyn to remind herself she still belonged to the living. But beneath that calm, something powerful was forming, like a tide gathering strength just before rising. Richard noticed it too. He visited more frequently, not out of obligation, but because the silence in his townhouse felt heavier now that he understood how much he had missed, how blind he had been. One afternoon, he stopped by with a folder under his arm and a stiffness in his shoulders that suggested he had spent the entire night awake. "Aubrey," he said, stepping into the kitchen, "I need a moment of your time." She poured him tea, still getting used to the version of him that accepted warmth without resisting it. "Is this about Julian?" "In a way." He set the folder down. "There's more to settle than his suspension. The board wants answers. Stability. A clear plan. And in order to protect you and Noah, I need to make a decision I should have made long ago." Aubrey felt tension creep up her spine. "What decision?" Richard took a slow breath. "To erase Julian's influence entirely." She blinked. "Richard, he's your son." "I know," he said softly. "And that's the burden I've carried far too long. Protecting him has caused more damage than facing the truth ever could." He slid the folder toward her. Inside were 2 documents, a full transfer of Julian's remaining voting power to an independent trustee, and a petition requesting a court-supervised restructuring of his inheritance. Aubrey looked up sharply. "You're cutting him out." "I'm giving him the chance," Richard corrected, "to rebuild his life without destroying everyone around him." She hesitated. "Do you think he'll ever change?" Richard's eyes dimmed. "Not while he believes he still has something left to control." Silence stretched across the kitchen, broken only by the sound of Noah humming from the living room as he colored. Aubrey closed the folder slowly. She understood what Richard was asking, not in words, but in responsibility. She would become part of the stabilizing force guiding the future of the Hale legacy, for Noah's sake. "I don't want revenge," she said finally. "I just want peace." "This," Richard replied gently, tapping the folder, "is the closest thing we can give you." She nodded, though her heartbeat trembled. That evening, she sat alone on the small balcony. Snow gathered on the railing, and warm light spilled from Noah's room where he'd fallen asleep reading his picture book. The city was quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that made a person feel suspended between past and future. A soft buzz interrupted her thoughts, a message from Nathan Pierce. "Checking on you. Not for legal reasons, just to make sure you're breathing in all of this." She smiled faintly. He had a way of phrasing concern that didn't feel intrusive. "I'm breathing," she replied. "Some days deeper than others. A moment later, that's enough. One breath is the start of everything." She stared at the words longer than she needed to. When she returned inside, she found Richard waiting near the doorway, hat in hand. "I have something else to tell you," he said. "Something personal." Aubrey paused. "What is it?" "I rewrote my own will," he said. "Not to replace Julian, but to ensure Noah's future doesn't depend on whether his father ever learns to be a decent man." Emotion punched the air from her lungs. "Richard, I don't know what to say. Just promise me one thing," he whispered. "Raise him to be better than both of us." Aubrey nodded, her voice barely audible. As he left, she stood by the door, her hand resting on the frame. For the first time, she sensed the future shifting, not because someone was pulling her, not because she was running, but because she was choosing. This decision wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, It didn't echo through boardrooms or shatter trust funds. It was quiet, personal, unshakable. Aubrey Collins was stepping into a role she never wanted, but one she was finally strong enough to carry. And that silent decision would change everything that came next. Julian Hale had always been a man who mistook audacity for intelligence. Even after being suspended and cut out of the boardroom, he still believed deeply, delusionally, that he could spin reality back under his control. He spent nights pacing the cramped rental where he was staying, lit only by the glow of his laptop, plotting a comeback that had less to do with redemption and more to do with revenge. In his mind, Christmas was the perfect stage. Public, emotional, symbolic, and he planned to reclaim his power, not through apology, but through spectacle. Julian convinced himself that the Hales were overreacting, that Aubrey was manipulative, that Charlotte was jealous of his position, and that Richard was simply old and confused. He rewrote the narrative until he became the victim. It was the only way he could bear his reflection. By mid-December, he began reaching out to old allies, investors who once admired him, a few socialites easily swayed by charm, even a tabloid journalist who owed him a favor. He leaked half-truths about false accusations, family betrayal, and a wife with emotional instability. He practiced lines in the mirror, rehearsing concern, regret, even manufactured tears. But the most disturbing part wasn't his strategy. It was his certainty that Noah still loved him more than Aubrey. "He's a kid," he muttered one night, pouring whiskey into a chipped glass. Kids forgive, kids forget. He believed that if he could get Noah to run into his arms publicly, Richard would cave, the board would reconsider, and Aubrey would crumble under the pressure. He would be seen as the misunderstood father trying to rebuild his family. The optics would be perfect, the sympathy automatic. To Julian, love wasn't love. It was leverage. He decided his grand gesture would happen at the Hale family's annual Christmas fundraiser at the River Terrace Ballroom, a tradition that went back 3 decades. Even after the chaos of the gala weeks earlier, Richard refused to cancel it. The fundraiser wasn't about the family. It supported children's hospitals across New York. Richard wouldn't punish innocent families because of Julian's destruction. Julian saw an opening. He arrived uninvited hours before the event, slipping through a side entrance with the confidence of someone who still believed the world belonged to him. He bribed a junior staff member to leave a back door unlocked. He studied the guest list, noting which influential names would attend. In his twisted mind, they weren't witnesses, they were tools. He planned every detail. He'd walk in at the height of the evening. He'd demand the mic for a brief family announcement. He'd talk about forgiveness, about a father's love, about fighting to be part of his son's life. Then he'd call for Noah. And he was certain, absolutely certain, that Noah would run to him, because Julian couldn't fathom a world where his own child feared him. Meanwhile, Aubrey prepared for the night with quiet dread. Richard insisted on extra security, and Charlotte remained glued to her side. They were cautious, but none of them knew the full extent of Julian's desperation. As the fundraiser began, the ballroom sparkled under thousands of white lights. Children sang carols, donors mingled, and soft laughter floated through the air. Aubrey held Noah's hand tightly, as though the room were made of glass. Near the entrance, a staff member hesitated, noticing a tall man in a dark coat lingering near the side door. Before she could alert anyone, he slipped inside with a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. Julian Hale was ready to rewrite the story, ready to reclaim what he believed was his, ready to destroy whatever stood between him and control. He straightened his tie, took a slow breath, and stepped deeper into the ballroom. It would take only one moment, one perfectly timed move, to change everything. At least, that's what he believed. The night before the fundraiser felt heavier than winter itself. Snow drifted past the townhouse windows in slow spirals, settling softly against the glass, but inside Aubrey's chest, a storm churned stubbornly. She tucked Noah into bed early, smoothing the blanket over his small shoulders, humming the lullaby her mother once sang to her. He drifted off with his hand loosely gripping hers, as if anchoring himself to the one constant he still recognized. She lingered beside him longer than she meant to. Something about the night pressed uneasily against her ribs. She couldn't name it, but she felt it the way animals sense an earthquake before the ground shifts. Downstairs, the house was dim except for the kitchen lamp. Charlotte sat at the counter with 2 mugs of peppermint tea, waiting for her. When Aubrey entered, Charlotte gave her a tentative smile. "You're thinking yourself into circles," she said gently. "I can't help it," Aubrey whispered, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "Tomorrow is the first big event since everything. What if people stare? What if they talk? What if they blame me for what happened to Julian?" Charlotte shook her head. "Anyone who blames you isn't worth hearing, and the ones who matter already know the truth." That should have comforted her. It didn't. She stared at her reflection in the window, the same eyes, the same face, but carrying a weight she hadn't asked for. She wondered if she would ever feel normal again, or if her life had been permanently split into before Julian and after Julian. Charlotte must have sensed her spiraling, because she set down her mug and said, "Come here." She guided Aubrey into the living room, where she had laid out a dress for the fundraiser. A simple winter white gown that wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, but elegant in its softness. "I thought you might want something that feels like you," Charlotte said. "Not like the version of you the Hales tried to manufacture." Aubrey touched the fabric with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful." "You're beautiful," Charlotte corrected. "This just reminds you." Aubrey exhaled shakily. "I'm scared of Julian." She paused. "That was part of it, but not the whole truth." "No. I'm scared of stepping into a room where everyone expects something from me. I'm scared of failing Noah. I'm scared of messing up whatever future Richard is trying to build. I'm scared of being seen." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't owe anyone a performance tomorrow. You just have to walk in with your son. That alone is victory." Aubrey nodded, but her chest still felt tight. Later that night, after Charlotte went home, Aubrey sat alone in Noah's room in the armchair near his bed. She curled her knees against her chest and rested her forehead on them. The house was silent except for the soft whir of the heater. Her mind drifted to Julian, his voice, his manipulations, the forged documents, the betrayal layered so deeply she was still peeling it apart. She remembered the first time he told her he loved her, the last time he made her feel afraid, the moment she realized survival meant letting go. She wondered where he was now, whether he was thinking about Noah, whether he blamed her for losing everything. She hoped he wasn't planning something, but fear clung stubbornly. A soft vibration buzzed from her phone, a message from Nathan Pierce. "Just wanted to wish you a quiet night before tomorrow, and to remind you storms don't last." She stared at the message, unexpectedly touched. Nathan had been steady through everything, not stepping in, not overstepping, just present. Something about his words loosened the knot in her chest. "Thank you," she typed back, trying to believe that. "You don't have to believe it," he replied. "Just rest. The world can wait." Over. Aubrey set the phone down and breathed. Deep. Slow. For the first time that night, the air didn't hurt. She kissed Noah's forehead and whispered, "Tomorrow will be okay." But even as she said it, she felt that same uneasy pull, the sense that something in the dark was shifting toward them, and she had no idea that Julian, miles away, was wide awake, rehearsing his plan, and preparing to turn Christmas into the stage of his final, desperate grasp for control. The River Terrace ballroom shimmered under 1,000 white lights, the Hudson River glinting just beyond the glass walls. Guests moved in clusters, executives in tailored tuxedos, donors in elegant gowns, children bundled in festive scarves for the holiday performances. A string quartet filled the room with quiet magic. It should have been a peaceful night, a celebration of hope. Instead, a subtle unease threaded the air like a whispered warning. Aubrey arrived holding Noah's hand, her winter-white dress simple yet stunning beneath the soft glow. She felt eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, others hesitant, as if uncertain how close they should stand to a woman whose life had exploded so publicly. But she held her head high, reminding herself with every breath, "You survived him. You survived everything." Charlotte walked at her side like a silent guardian. Richard followed a step behind, his presence steady, shielding her from unnecessary attention. "Mommy, can I get a cookie before the singing starts?" Noah asked. Aubrey smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Just one." As he scampered toward the dessert table, Charlotte whispered, "You're doing so well. Better than you think." "I don't feel brave," Aubrey replied. "That's what makes you brave," Charlotte said. But the uneasy tightness in Aubrey's chest didn't fade. She scanned the room, the entrances, the balcony, the corners where shadows lingered. She told herself it was just nerves, that the trauma of the past months was playing tricks on her. She didn't know Julian had already slipped inside. He stood near the side curtains, face shadowed by the warm lights, wearing a charcoal coat far too casual for the event. But he wasn't here to blend in. He was here for spectacle. His eyes followed Aubrey's every movement, studying the rhythm of her breathing, the tiny shifts in her posture. He wanted to see fear. Then he saw Noah, and his expression twisted into something triumphant, something hungry. "Tonight," he whispered to himself, "everything resets." Across the ballroom, Richard stepped onto the small stage to welcome the donors. Applause filled the room as he thanked them for supporting the Children's Hospital Fund. His speech was calm, measured, dignified, a man trying to rebuild trust after his own family had imploded. As he spoke, Aubrey felt a chill crawl up her spine. She turned and saw him, Julian. Their eyes met across the room, hers widening, his sharpening, and the sound around her muffled into a low hum. Her breath caught as her pulse hammered painfully against her ribs. Charlotte followed her stare and blanched. "Oh God, he's here. Where's Noah?" Aubrey's voice broke. Before Charlotte could answer, Noah's giggle rose from behind the dessert table, innocent, oblivious. Aubrey started toward him, but Julian moved first, weaving through the crowd like a predator slipping through tall grass. He reached Noah just as the child turned, holding a cookie with sprinkles. Noah froze. His smile faded. He stepped back, instinctively seeking distance. "Hey, buddy," Julian whispered with a forced warmth that chilled the air. "Come, give Daddy a hug." "Zoe." Noah shook his head, gripping his cookie like a shield. "Mommy said I stay near her." Julian crouched, voice dropping lower, sharper. "Your mother says a lot of things that aren't true." Aubrey's breath tore out of her. "Don't you touch him." Heads snapped toward her as she rushed across the ballroom, pushing through startled guests. Charlotte followed, shouting for security. Julian straightened slowly, like an actor savoring the climax of his scene. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out suddenly, projecting his voice above the music, "I have something important to say about my family." The quartet fell silent. Conversations died. Cameras lifted. The room pivoted toward him like a spotlight. Richard froze mid-sentence on stage, expression hardening, but Aubrey reached Julian first. She stepped between him and Noah, shielding her son with her entire body. "Don't you dare," she whispered, through shaking breath. "Not tonight." "Okay." Julian leaned in, smiling without warmth. "This is exactly the moment I've been waiting for." But before he could speak another word, a strong hand seized his shoulder. "Richard." His voice thundered loud enough to silence even the river outside. "Julian Hale, step away from them." Julian's smirk wavered. Because this time, the room wasn't confused. This time, every eye saw him clearly, and his plan, his grand Christmas gambit, was already collapsing. For a moment, no one in the ballroom moved. The string lights draped along the ceiling flickered softly, casting a glow over the scene that felt almost theatrical. Julian cornered, Aubrey shielding her son, Richard gripping his disgraced son's shoulder with a force that silenced even the most curious onlookers. "Let go of me," Julian hissed under his breath, twisting as though he could shake off decades of privilege collapsing around him. Richard didn't budge. "I told you not to come near them again," he said, each word a blade. Julian's eyes darted around the room. Dozens of faces stared back. Board members, investors, philanthropists, people whose opinions he had once worshipped. He straightened, plastering on a wounded expression. "It seems," he said loudly, "that my own family won't even allow me to speak to my child." Noah flinched. Aubrey pulled him closer. Gasps and murmurs rose, but not in Julian's favor. There was something different tonight, less confusion, more clarity. People had begun to learn the truth. "Don't twist this," Charlotte snapped, stepping forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. "You didn't come here for Noah. You came here for attention." Julian sneered. "Of course you'd take her side." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "There are no sides left, just consequences. Minors." Aubrey wanted to shrink back, to disappear from the circle forming around them, but something kept her grounded. Noah's trembling hand, the warmth of Richard standing firm beside her, and the quiet recognition that she wasn't the one being judged anymore. Julian lifted his chin. "I have every right to address this room. People deserve to hear the truth." "Then let's tell them," Richard said. He moved past Julian and stepped into the center of the ballroom as though taking the stage of a courtroom. Conversations stilled, all eyes turned. Richard's voice was deep, commanding. "Many of you are aware that my family has faced difficult revelations in recent months. I wanted these matters to remain private, but since my son insists on making a spectacle," he shot Julian a sharp glance, "then let the truth be public as well." Julian paled. "Dad, don't." "Silence," Richard said, not raising his voice yet somehow shaking the room. Aubrey instinctively braced herself, expecting blame, expecting disappointment. Old fear still lived in her bones, but Richard didn't look at her with shame. He looked at her with something closer to atonement. He addressed the crowd. "Aubrey Collins was not the cause of our family's turmoil. She was the victim of manipulation, deceit, and cruelty originating from the one person meant to protect her." "Bye." Gasps. Whispers. People leaned in. Julian stepped forward, desperate now. "You don't know what she's done." "No," Richard interrupted. "I know exactly what you have done." He signaled to Mr. Whitford, who stepped forward with a tablet. With a tap, audio from the gala began to play. Julian, coercing Aubrey with a fake diagnosis, urging her to sign over power of attorney. The room erupted. Someone whispered, "My God." Another said, "That's criminal." "Ow." Julian lunged for the tablet, but 2 security guards intercepted him. "You planned to take her child," Richard continued, "to create a false record of instability, to steal funds tied to the very foundation this event supports." Julian's face twisted. "This is a setup. This is all because you're choosing her, this woman, over your own blood." Richard's reply was quiet, but it carried farther than any shout. "I'm choosing integrity." Aubrey felt her breath catch. Richard turned to her, then truly turned to her, and said, "And I'm choosing the person my wife believed in long before I had the courage to." She pressed a hand to her mouth. Stunned, Julian snapped, "You think she deserves this respect? She's nothing. She was nothing before me." Aubrey stepped forward. "No," she said, voice steady. "I was someone before you. I just forgot for a while." And tens froze. The room applauded, not loudly, but in a low, rising wave of approval that washed over her, warm and steady. Julian's mask split completely. He lunged. Toward her, toward Noah. Security grabbed him instantly. A terrified cry escaped Noah's throat as Julian was pinned to the ground, struggling, shouting incoherent threats. Aubrey dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around her son. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you. Mummy's here." 24. Richard knelt beside them, placing a trembling hand on the boy's back, and as Julian was dragged from the ballroom, screaming into the cold night, the truth settled over everyone. This wasn't just the unraveling of a man. It was the liberation of his victim, and the rebirth of the family he tried to destroy. The ballroom felt strangely hollow after Julian was dragged out, like all the oxygen he once poisoned the room with had finally disappeared, leaving behind a fragile, stunned silence. The guests didn't know whether to return to their conversations or simply stand in the stillness, witnessing a moment too raw to ignore. The string quartet attempted to resume playing, but the first trembling notes collapsed into silence again. The real performance was happening in the center of the room. Aubrey knelt on the floor beside Noah, holding him as if she were afraid he might dissolve in her arms. His small body shook with leftover terror, but he clung to her like she was the last solid thing in the world. And maybe she was. Charlotte rushed to them, breathless. "Is he hurt? Aubrey, are you okay?" Aubrey nodded, though her hands trembled. "We're okay. We're okay now." But her eyes lifted and found Richard. He stood a few feet away, shoulders tight, breath unsteady. His usually stern expression had cracked open into something unmistakably human. Grief, regret, and something deeper resolve. Slowly, he approached them. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a quiet path through the aftermath. Richard crouched down beside them, the old stiffness in his knees evident but ignored. He looked first at Noah, then at Aubrey. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but trembled with conviction. "No one," he said, "will ever harm you again. Not while I'm still breathing." Aubrey swallowed hard, emotion burning her throat. "Richard, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently. "For too long, I stood still. I convinced myself that Julian would grow out of his cruelty, that it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage. But tonight," his voice cracked, "tonight I saw what I should have seen years ago. You weren't trying to tear this family apart. You were the only one trying to hold it together." Aubrey's breath shook. Charlotte touched her father's arm, urging him to continue. Richard reached out, hesitating for a moment, before placing a hand over Aubrey's. "My wife believed in you before she ever met you. She saw goodness where I saw a threat to our name. But she was right, and I was blind." He looked at Noah next, so small, so vulnerable. "This little boy deserves a life free of fear. And you deserve a life free of my son's shadow." Aubrey opened her mouth, but no words came. Tears she'd held back for years pushed forward. Richard took a slow, steady breath. Then he said the words that changed everything. "I've rewritten my estate. Effective immediately. You, Aubrey Collins, are the guardian of the Hale Philanthropic Trust, and Noah is the sole heir to everything I intended for Julian." Gasps spread through the crowd like a soft explosion. Even Charlotte's eyes widened, though she hadn't expected the announcement to be so public, so final. Aubrey stared at him, completely stunned. "Richard, I can't accept that. People will say I manipulated." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "I know the truth, and anyone worth knowing does too." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "But this is your legacy." He nodded. "Exactly. And I choose to place it in hands that won't squander it." A murmur rippled through the ballroom, not of scandal, but of admiration. Something had shifted. Something old and rotted had been cut away, and what remained was strangely, unexpectedly hopeful. Richard wasn't finished. "In front of every witness here," he continued, rising slowly but with authority, "I want it known that Aubrey Collins is family, not by marriage, by choice, my choice." Aubrey covered her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers. Noah looked up at his grandfather, eyes brimming. "Does that mean you pick Mommy?" Richard's voice gentled. "Yes, Noah, I pick your mum. I pick both of you." The little boy launched himself into Richard's arms, the tension finally releasing in one pure burst of relief. Aubrey watched them, chest aching with a joy so unfamiliar she didn't know how to hold it. For the first time since marrying into the Hale family, she wasn't the outsider. She wasn't the burden. She wasn't the accusation. She wasn't the excuse. She was the choice. And as Richard wrapped both arms around Noah, then reached one hand toward her, inviting her into the embrace, Aubrey stepped forward without fear. Her past had nearly destroyed her, but her future had just chosen her back. In the days that followed the fundraiser, the Hale family name buzzed through Manhattan like a spreading wildfire, except this time it wasn't scandal that carried the flame, but transformation. The board issued formal statements about restructuring. Donors praised Richard's integrity, and quietly, discreetly, security measures doubled around the townhouse where Aubrey and Noah lived. But inside that townhouse, life took on a different rhythm. Slower, softer, almost peaceful. Noah slept through the night again for the first time in months. Aubrey watched him curled into his blanket, his breaths even and untroubled, and felt something inside her unclench, something she didn't know she'd been holding. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her door. Richard's handwriting, neat, deliberate. "Thank you for your courage. Thank you for protecting my grandson. And thank you for giving this family a chance to be better than it was. R.H." Aubrey folded the note gently and placed it in her drawer. She wasn't sure whether it felt like closure or a beginning. Later that afternoon, Charlotte stopped by with grocery bags and a grin. "All right," she said, setting them down. "We're making soup." Aubrey laughed. "Soup? Why soup?" "Because the world is chaos," Charlotte replied, pulling vegetables from the bags. "And soup is order." Aubrey shook her head, but something warm filled her chest. Charlotte had become more than an ally. She was family in the truest sense, a sister not by blood, but by battle. As they chopped vegetables, Charlotte said, "Dad wants you to take a more active role in the foundation. He trusts you." Aubrey froze mid-slice. "Me? Charlotte, I don't know anything about running a philanthropic organization." "You know how to care," Charlotte said. "That's the part everyone else forgets." Aubrey looked down, flustered. "I don't want people thinking I'm taking advantage of." "No one who matters thinks that," Charlotte interrupted gently. "And if they do, they're wrong." It should have been a simple conversation. But those words, "he trusts you," echoed inside her, stirring something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. That evening, as Noah colored in the living room, Aubrey stepped onto the balcony. Snow was beginning to fall again, soft and quiet. The city lights reflected off each flake, like tiny stars drifting toward Earth. Her phone buzzed. A message from Nathan Pierce. "Saw the news. Proud of you. And relieved you're safe. If you ever want to talk about legal things or not legal things, I'm here." Aubrey felt heat rise to her cheeks, unexpected but not unwelcome. She typed back, "Thank you. Things feel different now. I feel lighter." Nathan responded almost instantly. "You should. You've carried too much for too long." She hesitated, then wrote, "Maybe when things settle, we could get coffee? A real one. Not a crisis coffee." This time, the pause felt intentional. "Then, I'd like that very much." Aubrey smiled. Small, private, peaceful. But the world outside her window wasn't entirely peaceful. Across town, Julian's situation worsened. He had been charged with multiple counts: financial misconduct, attempted fraud, harassment, and reckless endangerment. His lawyers scrambled, but the evidence was overwhelming, especially the audio recordings, the forged documents, the footage from the resort. He tried to call Aubrey once. She blocked the number. He tried twice more. She blocked the new numbers, too. Eventually, even the noise faded. One night, Richard called her. "He's agreed to a plea deal," he said. "Mandatory rehabilitation, financial restitution, and strict boundaries regarding you and Noah. Aubrey exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. Thank you. I should be thanking you, Richard said. You saved my family, Aubrey, even when it tried to break you. She swallowed the lump in her throat. After they hung up, she walked to Noah's room. He was asleep, clutching his stuffed bear. She brushed a hand over his hair and whispered, "We're okay now. We really are." And for the first time in years, maybe in her entire adulthood, she believed it. Not because someone told her she was safe, not because she clung to survival, but because she had built a life where safety wasn't borrowed. It was hers. And as the snow continued falling over Brooklyn, Aubrey Collins stepped quietly into the first true beginning she'd ever been given. 1 year later, snow blanketed Brooklyn with the same soft hush as the winter before, but everything else had changed. The townhouse, once a temporary shelter, had transformed into a real home, filled with warm lights, children's drawings taped to the walls, and the quiet confidence of a life rebuilt from ashes. Aubrey stood in the kitchen, stirring hot cocoa, the scent of cinnamon drifting through the house. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, her face softer now, no longer tightened by fear or exhaustion. Healing hadn't been linear, but it had been real. And tonight was proof. "Mommy!" Noah's excited voice echoed down the hall. "He's here," Aubrey smiled. She already knew who he meant. Nathan Pierce stepped into the doorway, brushing snow from his coat. His cheeks were cold, but his eyes were warm in a way she had grown to trust over the past months. They hadn't rushed anything. Coffee turned into conversation, conversation into friendship, and friendship into something deeper, steady, patient. "Hope I'm not too early," he said. "You're right on time," Aubrey replied. Noah zipped across the room, nearly tackling Nathan in a hug. "We made cookies, real ones." "I helped," Nathan laughed. "Then they're definitely the best cookies in New York." Aubrey watched them, a quiet awe blooming in her chest. For so long she had believed her future would always carry Julian's shadow. But here, in her modest kitchen with mismatched mugs, holiday music humming softly, and 2 people she loved, she realized she had stepped into a completely different life. Later that evening, Richard arrived, walking slower these days but with a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. This Christmas, he carried no weight of shame or denial, only gratitude. "Grandpa!" Noah sprinted forward again, nearly lifting him off his feet. Richard held him tight. "You keep getting bigger, young man." "And stronger," Noah added proudly. Richard winked at Aubrey. Just like his mother, they gathered around the tree, small compared to the Hale family's old 15-foot showpiece. But this one had ornaments that meant something. Handmade ones. Imperfect ones. Ones that felt like memory instead of performance. Aubrey handed Richard a mug of cocoa. "Thank you for being here. There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he said. "This is home now," and he meant it. As Noah played with his new toy train, the adults settled into the living room. Nathan sat quietly beside Aubrey, not crowding her, simply present. He had learned her rhythms well when she needed space, when she needed reassurance, and when she needed silence that wasn't empty. "You've built something beautiful," Nathan said softly to her. She glanced around the room, at Noah laughing, at Richard smiling tenderly, at the soft glow of the lights reflecting off the window. "I didn't build it alone," she answered. "No," he agreed. "But you're the reason it's possible." Aubrey felt her throat tighten not with grief, but with gratitude. She thought of where she had been a year ago, broken, humiliated, terrified. And now, she was whole. Not perfect, but whole. Nathan cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. I brought you something." He handed her a small box, not fancy, wrapped clumsily in red paper. She opened it slowly. Inside was a silver pendant shaped like a tiny open door. "It's not jewelry," Nathan said quickly. "Well, it is, but it's more like a reminder that you walked through something impossible and came out stronger." Aubrey blinked back tears. "It's beautiful." Richard watched from across the room, smiling knowingly. He leaned back in his chair, murmuring to himself, "Lillian would have loved this." Aubrey squeezed the pendant gently. "This feels like the first Christmas that's actually mine." Nathan reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, steady and certain. Outside, snow drifted peacefully past the window. Inside, laughter rose, soft and warm, filling the home she had rebuilt from courage and heartbreak and hope. Aubrey looked at her son, at Richard, at Nathan, and understood something she once thought was impossible. She hadn't just survived. She hadn't just escaped. She had rebuilt a life filled with love, respect, safety, and a future free of fear. Her story didn't end with betrayal. It ended with belonging. This Christmas, she wasn't chosen because she needed saving. She was chosen because she deserved it. So that's the end of the story. And if you're still here, reading this far, then something from Aubrey's journey has touched your heart in a very special way. Perhaps you've realized that sometimes life tests us, not to break us, but to show us who's truly on our side. The Stoic said, "The obstacle is the way." And it's true, it was the pain, betrayal, and heartbreak that led Aubrey to freedom, to healthy love, and to the life she deserved. This story reminds us, you are not weak when you walk away from something that hurts you. You are strong when you choose yourself and dare to start over. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." That is how Aubrey stands up with truth, with kindness, and with the belief that she is worthy of love. If this story made you think, made you feel like you're not alone, or simply lightened your heart a little, please hit like, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they're strong enough, and subscribe to our channel to join us on our next journey.